Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining me and our speakers for day 2 of Graphics Project 2021. Today we have with us Andrew Keung and Michael McDowell. They're both recent graduates from the M.Arch program, and they've come back to us to talk through the process of putting together a GSAPP graduation portfolio, which I know that all of you are starting to think about or have already. Now with the benefit of hindsight and a little bit of distance, how they got started, what was difficult, what worked well and what didn't, they'll talk us through their decision-making process. Michael is the winner of the Simpson Prize for Excellence in Design. Andrew is the winner of the Charles McKim Prize for Excellence in Design, as well as the Saul Kaplan Travel Fellowship. Putting together your own body of work from 1, 2, 3 years of various studios and classes in some sort of cohesive volume is already not an easy task. But the class of 2020 had to deal with another level of complication, as you know. They began their spring semesters in 2020 with a set of expectations which were then completely reshuffled. Andrew and Michael, like everyone else, probably were imagining putting together a book with pages you flip with your fingers, thinking about size, maybe even considering certain types of paper or printing or binding methods. And then by mid-March, I'm guessing they've had to hit pause and take a moment and then decide whether they would stay calm and carry on or rethink everything. While equally deliberate and thoughtful, I think Michael and Andrew have actually ended up taking slightly different approaches. Let's hear from each of them about how they dealt with the sudden shift, but also how they dealt with some of the more universal questions of bookmaking and narrative making. They've actually both been students of mine at different points and have produced some excellent work in the class. So I'm particularly happy to see them again and welcome them back tonight. Michael will begin and then Andrew will follow up. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Hi, everyone. So as Yoonjai mentioned, I'll be presenting on my portfolio. Mine was mostly designed as a book, obviously then presented digitally. And one second, it's a bit slow. Okay, so I set up the presentation so that I'll talk about what I was trying to achieve with my portfolio, then followed by step by step of how I put together a sample spread. And then I'll continue on to some of the other spreads, and I'll go back to the beginning of the portfolio, looking at how the table of contents was assembled, and then the cover and the back. And finally, I'll end with a look at typesetting and some things that I learned along the way. So this is also how I more or less assembled my portfolio, and it also allowed me to get an idea of how working through a spread, I arrived at the concept of the book itself, similarly to how we would design an architectural project. And these are all the materials I had to work with, which was a lot for me, as it probably is for everyone else. And I wanted to go back and edit all the drawings. Obviously, I didn't have as much time as I wish I had, and make them more consistent. So in the end, it was mostly about finding small adjustments that I could work with, and then finding a way in which these could all fit together. I also, at some point, I decided that having the differences become part of the idea of the portfolio was kind of important to me. So I used quite a rigid spread that would be what would be tying the book together. And I'll get into some of this in a little more detail in a second. On top of this, I wanted to make sure that the portfolio wasn't too repetitive or bland, but also about having a consistent spread. So I tried to ensure that there was enough variety from spread to spread to keep the viewer interested. So then the last element was having an overall order and categorization of the project. And that's something I was interested in having, but this didn't work as well for me. So instead, the complexities of the book became sort of, again, the main concept of the book. So looking at the sample spread, I started off with a page size. I wanted to make a book that was skinnier than your typical 8.5 by 11 magazine, which is something you would see with like Architectural Digest. This was in part because of the proportion of the page that I preferred. It also I was also referencing Apartamento magazine, which is again smaller, and they are able to fit like 2 images and some text quite well. And then jumping onto the margins, I decided to have a larger top and bottom margin, in part because I would want to have information at the top and the bottom, and then the edges would be smaller. And I was looking at wire binding as a method, which is similar to that's what's used for GSAPP abstract. So that would let me probably have a thinner edge. Whereas if I had perfect bounded, which is what you see with a typical book, then that would not lay flat. So on top of that, I had my text usually away from that center edge. Then looking at the grid, I set up a grid that was sort of small enough to give me enough variety, so that I could work with, for example, a 2x2 grid with a landscape image, or a 3x3, or a 2x3 in a vertical position. But I also didn't want to have a grid that was too small that would then defeat the purpose of having a grid. So I found that the smallest unit size that I would be using was sort of like a good rule of thumb, so not going smaller than I would be using. And then, so this is sort of an idea of that, and how these different images could sort of fit within the spread. Since making the portfolio, I found this book by Pentagram, which if you're able to find out, definitely take a look at. It's called Living by Design, and it's from 1978, so it's quite old, but it's actually quite good because it has a lot of the projects at the time sort of put together. So it's kind of like a portfolio for a graphic design company. And I found that they sort of had a grid that they were also breaking in several ways. For example, in this spread in which the grid is broken, but it's still quite cohesive overall. Then looking at the folio or page numbering, for me, I wanted, well, before I get into that, the folio could definitely go, as you may know, on the top, on the sides, like center or corners, bottom corners, as I have it. For me, it was sort of important to anchor the page, both at the bottom and the top. So the folio is in both the corners and with quite a large font size. Then the header is something that I'll talk a bit more in depth about, as this is kind of where the sort of concept or the main idea of the portfolio became clearer. A good reference for me, this is not specific to headers, but to the idea of sort of general navigation of a book, was Neil Donnelly's book for Work AC, in which the edge of the page has 3 different colors based on the era from their work. Obviously, I did not have different eras for the portfolio, but as I said before, I didn't really have categories, but as I started to look at the work as a whole, I realized that it was mostly a collection of speculations on issues related to different topics. So I began listing all the projects, some of them got bundled up into one category versus others were singular. So for example, burials, there was one project. And I went through each sort of topic that I had, from burials, housing, wildlife, rural flight, water, borders, brownfields, graphics, infrastructure, and civic spaces. So having this at the top became a way for me to clearly see, or I guess for the viewer to also see at what point in the book they were, but also sort of get a general understanding about the topic that was being discussed. And again, along with the folio, it would sort of anchor the page at the top. Then getting into the idea of the title, and I'm going to talk about the typeface here a bit more too. I began looking at Log for inspiration. I thought that their use of Garamond is quite successful for a literary journal, as it uses a typeface that is usually seen in body text, Garamond, but instead they use it for the cover. And at the same time, I was looking at Experimental Jet Set and their use of Helvetica. And particularly in this image, I found it interesting how you can see the use of the positive and the negative space within the letters. So from there, I decided that Arial would be quite fitting for me. When you read about Arial, it usually is described as a bit of a bland font, but I thought that maybe by using Arial Black, the boldness would sort of lend itself to covering a variety of different projects, and it wouldn't be so distinct that it would be only more fitting with certain type of projects. And that's something that I was trying to work with throughout the portfolio, since a lot of my representation was different, and at first it didn't seem as cohesive as I wish it had been. And I decided to go all uppercase for the title with Arial Black. Again, I thought that the shape of the all caps worked better for me than the lowercase or title case. And then I had a subtitle in which I use Arial Bold Italic, and the Arial Bold is actually it doesn't seem that bold, especially at this scale. And I sort of use the italics and again the lowercase to define the hierarchy within the page. And this is something that we looked at in Yoonjai's GSAPP class, in which we looked at museum tags and designed how the hierarchy would be established based on simple changes in the typeface that's being used. Then the next item was the body text, in which I was using, again, Arial Bold, but I wanted to have it oversized, mostly so, in part because I didn't want to have too much text that got lost and was never read. So by having it occupy a large part of the space, but not having much text, I was sort of forced to condense the amount of text, and it would still have a strong presence of the page. I was mostly thinking of my texts as blocks or images, so that then the spread, when it's all assembled, each element that I'm describing now acts as sort of like a black sort of block that then gets replaced by the specific text or the specific images. Finally, the last element would be the image caption. That is, again, with the Arial Black and Bold and much smaller size. And the idea is that it would have sort of these spaces where it can shift left and right based on the needs of each spread. And then as I introduce the image, I'll get into this in a minute and how the image can take different shapes and forms within the spreads. And this was the final spread once it's done. And again, emphasizing this point that to me was also about working compositionally with these images as just boxes. And even though I didn't do this in the process, I was always trying to make sure that the composition of the spread itself sort of worked well together. And I'll get into some other spreads and how I allowed the spreads to either break the grid or work with the grid, also to create as much variety as I could, because I don't want it to be too monotonous, then there's no excitement to the book. So in this spread, for example, I was using a square image, and that was another aspect about this grid that I enjoyed, was that by doing this 3x4 grid, I was able to get a square. And then the image on the right, this drawing is about like twice the size. And I feel like this is something that happens a lot at GSAPP, is that we have a lot of drawings that have a lot of detail, but then when you put them in the portfolio, you don't really get to see it. So to me, just cropping it was something that I was fine with. And as long as I was showing the important part of the drawing, I think that's like fine to do. Another element that I thought added variety was to sort of invert the colors of the spread. So in this case, using a black background, and this really only works for certain drawings. Some, like I tried through a few of them, and it didn't always work. In this case, I think it was because of the line work really actually worked well. And sometimes you actually want to increase the line weight whenever you invert it. So this was a process of inverting, but then also maybe like layering it in Photoshop or actually editing the drawings so that the line weights would read better. And this is another thing that I saw also in the pentagram book. So I guess another idea would potentially be to, if you have an existing drawing with a white background, you could just change the background to black and it might read well too. Another sort of type of spread that I was working with was a sort of a very balanced spread. In this case, I had sort of two very similar floor plans, but they described different things. So I thought that having them side to side will create more of like a common spread. And then the caption, instead of having each one under the image, I thought that it might be better to sort of have two lines of captions so that it, again, going back to the idea of a block, so it reads more as a block rather than sort of distributed text throughout. And this was another example in which I did the same, except this time with the square layout. And then on the other hand, as opposed to creating sort of a balance, I wanted to create a hierarchy. In this case, I had sort of a line work drawing and then something that was more raster based. And I found that, at least in this example, having the line work and the larger part of the page was able to balance itself with the smaller raster image so that the sort of Photoshop image doesn't take too much presence and like leaves the line work to be forgotten. And that's something I found that happened a lot with plans and sections too. And again, working with the grid, I thought that having a grid that would allow me to have sort of a smaller image was quite useful for me. And if you can tell, like half of the page is just white. And that also helped a lot, I think, with sort of the progression of the spreads. This is another example in which I did a similar thing, except this time the image is actually quite small. Also that would be based on the amount of information detail that each of the images has. Obviously, this plan had a lot more detail than this render on the left. Then another topic that I also was looking at, or I guess approach to imagery, was whenever I had an image that did not have sort of a fixed boundary, I was generally trying to keep the sort of the non-straight edge away from other images. So for example, in this image, in the bottom right, it's all white, so that it doesn't create like an awkward space between the images. So I think considering the edges of your image whenever and how it relates to the other elements on the page is quite important too. And going back to the same reference, that's another thing they did, and I think it's quite successful. And it can actually make the spread read more interesting and sort of break the visualness of like constantly seeing rectangles throughout the whole portfolio. Then for whenever I had models, I found that I had a lot of model photography that maybe wasn't the best. And I was trying to work with it and I was wondering like, if I should even use them or not. And I feel like there are a lot of ways to like sort of go around this. One of them to me was just editing the background. And this also served to me, or it helped me because a lot of my drawings were quite monotonous, maybe black and white or just grayscale. So being able to change the background, or even it could be the image itself of the model to a different color, brought some attention and some like variety to a portfolio that otherwise might be a bit too monotonous. And then again, how I use the grid, sometimes leaving a bit more open white space at the bottom, and not trying to force it always to fit the same space. Then another, this is one of the last ones, I promise. One of the other grids that I used was sort of like grid within a grid. And I was fine breaking the grid in these cases, I felt like that was not an issue. In this case, I was breaking the vertical grid and not the horizontal grid. And this, again, provides a sort of a different typology, one that I found was quite interesting. And in this case, I wasn't even following any of the grids. I do feel like this one is probably a bit more successful than the second one. But again, probably providing a bit of variety throughout the portfolio is quite useful. And then lastly, for each project, I had an organization in which the end of the project would always end with a full bleed image. And that was in part so that I was able to have some full bleed images, but also to sort of indicate to the viewer that the project was ended and you wouldn't be expecting another image to come after you see the full spread. So these are two examples of that. And then the last item I wanted to talk about was also how sometimes it's just so to me, it's okay to show sort of the same drawing twice with maybe two different levels of zoom, or maybe in two different parts of the book, as they can actually convey quite different types of information from like the sort of general to the more specific. Then jumping into the table of contents, I remember in last year's presentation, there were quite a few examples of like how a table of contents could be laid out. To me, it seemed like continuing the idea of the Arial black and its boldness and sort of the intensity of it was quite appropriate. And having it listed in this manner where it takes up almost the whole page, and again, the numberings go all the way up to the hundreds, would make it seem as if there's like an abundance of information and complexity, which also is a bit tying into the idea of the portfolio, sort of trying to grapple with a lot of different issues and not so much not being so categorical. And then for the cover and back, it seemed appropriate to have sort of the header listed in the front. Again, left aligned, so the same as I did the body text, in part because this read to me a bit more like a list and a bit more casual and not so like fixed by the boxes. Also because to me, graphically, this would probably read better versus it being justified, in which the letters would have to be spread. And I'll get into the justification comments in a moment. And then the back also seemed quite appropriate to sort of continue the idea of the redaction, also to sort of indicate to the viewer that the book has ended, and also tying to the header. So the last thing that I'll talk about is typesetting, and some things that I learned along the way that were useful to me, might be useful for some. So for example, this is how the text comes out of InDesign as I typed it. And sorry, I'm trying to move this part. So the leading, I found that the leading which is the space between the sort of the two lines of text, when you're having a display text or like a big title, might be a bit too big. So an adjustment that I found interesting or useful was to reduce the leading for titles, then at the same time adjusting the kerning, which is a space between individual letters, and sometimes the tracking, which is a space, the overall space. So the tracking will adjust it for all the letters at once, versus the kerning you can individually adjust the spacing, for example, between the I and the M, or the N and the G. Then looking at body text, this is again how InDesign sort of put the text when I typed it in. But then to me, increasing the leading was quite important, so that it would again occupy a larger part of the page, and that it would read a bit more casual as opposed to of it being justified. And this is what it would have been if it was justified. And something that happens with justification is that it creates these things called rivers. I'm not sure if you know about them, but basically, since the words are being stretched, for example, here, there's such few words that the spacing becomes much larger than it would be in sort of in a sentence that has, or in a line that has more text. And there are a couple of ways to sort of work around these issues. So for example, in InDesign, if you would go to a paragraph on the top right, select justification, you'd be able to look at these different settings. So by adjusting these different settings, you can almost immediately see how the spacing between the letters is much more uniform, or the words. And that is basically controlled through word spacing, letter spacing, and glyph scaling. Glyph scaling being sort of the scale of each individual letter. So you obviously not want to change it too drastically, otherwise it would look probably a bit weird. And then the last item would be hyphenation, which to me is something that I would always do if I were to justify text. And you can actually control the hyphenation settings in InDesign. So you can set it to be words with at least a certain number of letters. You can also prevent it from hyphenating capitalized words, like a name, or hyphenating the last word. And then this is a last item on the presentation, looking at the underline options. You can, if you go to character and go to underline options, you can change the weight and the offset of the underlining. And this is how I did the sort of the redacting in my portfolio, in which I increase the weight and change the offset. The offset, it moves it up and down. And then you can make the color whatever color you like. And then this is a sort of the default type of line. You can also change it to something more fun, like these diagonal lines or even these curvy lines. And that's it. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing the screen. I'll pass it on to Andrew.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Let me share my screen 1 second. Okay, can everyone see this? So hey everyone, this is my portfolio, and I'm gonna start off with talking about the cover page and the theme. And for me, very opposite of Michael, I went with all lowercase, which I thought was kind of funny. And I thought it was really important to kind of understand my work at a very base level. And what I did to do that was I kind of just typed them all out in very simple terms in describing each project. And I just used that as the cover. And how I landed here was kind of thinking about all of my work in general and what I was ultimately trying to achieve at GSAPP. And I thought that the portfolio would be a good time to think about the theme that I kind of went through. And it's important to find a concept that's like descriptive enough that it's not about like everything you could possibly do, but also flexible enough that it incorporates like any like outliers that you may have. And I think instead of one project at GSAPP that is our thesis, we get a body of work that acts as our thesis. So in this way, it's a good way of thinking about how your work is, but also how it will become in the future. And so in my case, I chose lowercase, so that would a lot, as a way to think about how architecture is less about just like the ego of the architect, maybe thinking about how it connects into different systems, politically, socially. And one thing I want to mention now, since we're here, is that with the digital portfolio, the biggest thing is that there's no spine. And the benefit of that is you can put content right at the center. And that was a way for me to also tell myself that this portfolio should not be printed. So I put things right at the spine. So if it is printed and it was kind of split into two pages, that it just wouldn't work. And I also split my portfolio into two parts because I saw that there was sort of like when I was looking at the theme, I saw that there was also a turning point in my projects and how I approached my studios. And I thought it'd be a good way to also set the viewer up in terms of their expectations of how they would view the work going forward. And so this is the first project. And like Michael said before, we have a lot of huge drawings at GSAPP. And so I think laying out things on a grid is actually incredibly helpful, which is, for me, I've kind of borrowed it from web design. I use just vertical grids with no kind of horizontal lines for the most part, except for the top, as you can see here. And this way I thought, even though I don't exactly line up with it all the time, it was a really good way for me to kind of use it in projects that had much more complex images. And also in my project, in portfolio, I decided to use dialog boxes. Kind of reminiscent of Clippy of like early 2000s or 90s web design or interfaces, because I wanted my text to be a part of the page, but also like a separate guide almost when you need it, or even if you don't. It's just a kind of way for me to insert my voice in there very clearly. And so this project was about mining parking lots and how to kind of use those in dilapidated old lots as like a way of talking about mining extraction. And it's like a very step-by-step project. But what I really want to get to is how to talk about your large drawings. And so these drawings were 4 feet wide, and in total it was like about 6 feet tall on the wall. And I think the problem with digital portfolios and portfolios is when you have a big drawing, how are you supposed to put it into a small portfolio? Some people will look these on their phone or tablets, and how to kind of give the respect that these drawings need. And one way I did that was I looked at Instagram and how you have these images where you can just scroll from left to right. So looking at kind of this kind of way to flip through images, I thought that'd be a nice way to pan through my huge drawings. And so we can see here in this plan, going from one image to the next, kind of go from one to the other, kind of scrolling down, and also from this one from left to right. And in this next project, this project was also another very big project, talking about the Green New Deal. So it was a project that was really large in scale, but also in time, because it was over the course of 30 years. And so this project, as you can see, it's quite large drawings, but also in terms of talking about scale, I also wanted to emphasize the horizontality. So in this project, I'm going to kind of mention the dimensions of my page. And I chose a dimension which was 2 by 1, which is not exactly conventional for digital work or print work. But in my case, it worked because of Instagram again, how you can have 2 square images next to each other and just pan through them. So I thought that would be an effective way for me to communicate my drawings. And also, in this way, you're able to emphasize both one image in the center, like you have here, but also when you go from left to right, you can also have this, this narrative or movement. So I really emphasize the horizontality of the layout in using these long sections here. And another thing when looking at digital work was looking at the gallery view that you'd have on websites. So I wanted to kind of remind the viewer that this is a digital presentation, that maybe there's like other work coming next. So I have this kind of cheeky way of like peeking the next drawing that's gonna come by. Again, using the movement that you can get through this animation sort of storytelling. And I guess here would be a good point to talk about like full bleed drawings. I also, similarly to Michael, use them as a way to end off each project. But in my case, because the beginning of every project has this blue cover, it wasn't really an issue in terms of kind of separating projects. But I thought it was also a good way of giving the viewer a kind of overview of like what they've just been reading through. So this next project was completed in the last semester of school, and it was actually when the pandemic hit. So half of this project was done in Canada with my partner in New York. And the interesting thing about this project is that it was done in a manner that was based on physical models, photography, and drawing, and kind of repeating that process over and over again. So the sort of makeshift manner of this project really led to a lot of small images or kind of loose research. So this was a project that I really was able to use the grid to organize my work because of all of the sort of piecemeal objects on the page. And so I think like one thing that's quite clear in my portfolio is that in terms of layout for each project, there is not too much similarity, simply because of the breadth of different drawings that I used in each project. But the consistency, I think, of mine was through the use of these dialog boxes, a consistent kind of information on the right side of the page, in that way. And again, we have the sort of panning motion going from left to right of one big drawing here. And so here we have part 2. And coincidentally, like I split the portfolio right in half, but it also kind of made sense because it was my advanced studios in the beginning and then core studios at the end. And I did this because there was a very big shift in terms of how I approached my work. Yet there was also somewhat of a consistent thread going throughout. And it was in the fact that I sort of end off with housing in each of the 3 projects. So in the past project, it was about kind of extending people's homes again, using kind of makeshift props and platforms that like make self-built communities more social, connected to infrastructures. And then in the next project, it's also about bringing people out of their homes, which at a time like this might not be the best, but I guess it's a product of its time. And so, yeah, that's how I kind of divided my portfolio. And in this project, we talked about kind of the 3 ways of addressing kind of tower and park typologies. And I guess I want to talk about here is how you lay out each project and kind of the order of drawings. In this one, I went from large scale to small, as you can kind of see as we go through. You have a site plan, kind of this overview a bit closer, a plan of the buildings on the inside, a section going into the building now, and then tower, 1 floor, and then into the unit. And one thing that I found this was helpful for was that you can kind of give the viewer a sort of easy way to read into your project, especially when it's like a more conventional project like a building this way. And also with my portfolio, I also went away with a lot of captions because oftentimes you'll see captions like section or plan or model photo. And I always found that it wasn't necessarily needed in my portfolio because it was generally obvious like that this would be a model photo or this would be a collage or something like that. So I thought it would be a cleaner way of approaching my portfolio. I don't think it's, and especially for when you have captions such as like scale 1/8 or things like that. When it's digital, it doesn't really matter anymore. And for me, I think if you want to convey that, it's better to just show it in your drawings, how much detail they have, rather than like writing out like this is a 1/4 scale drawing, because it doesn't really matter when everyone's screen is a different size. And this next project was developed the semester that Trump was inaugurated, so it's actually kind of interesting now that he's gone. But this was a project where some people, it kind of felt like there was a different population that we just weren't a part of, and I wanted to kind of convey the idea of adjacencies in both the form and the program of this building. So this building was about the curve and the line, how they kind of inform each other's movements, creating nooks and pores throughout the volume. And in this program diagram, I've kind of illustrated that how like different colors of each program are never kind of next to one of its own. So kind of creating these adjacencies. And similarly in this project, I laid it out kind of in a way that would allow for a long drawing like this to be still clear, I guess, with like kind of moving down throughout the floors of the building. And here we have this. And then I wanted to end my portfolio with the 2 projects that were in my first semester, kind of making it a full circle. And another reason for doing that was that I felt that these projects were less systematic and more experimental in terms of form and play. And this project was like a lost and found archive where like objects had houses that were underground, and above ground they would kind of serve people. And this next project was a project about kind of like a peer project. But yeah, so that's like in terms of looking through my portfolio, I think the order and layout was like that. And then I decided to end it with like a cheeky part 3 of projects that I don't put on my portfolio, just as a way to kind of end it off. But what I really wanted to get to is the most painful part of doing a portfolio, which is file compression. And it's really painful because you think you're done, but you're actually not. And so hopefully the next steps will help you guys experience less pain than I have in the past. So the first step is to not have any working files in your portfolio, in your InDesign. So you should always compress your drawings before putting them into InDesign. So with line drawings, you put them as PNGs, and as renders and photos as JPEGs. And another thing is you want to have your color space correct. So if you want to print something, you want to have it in CMYK. And if it's for digital, you want to have it as RGB. And this will really affect the colors that you can pick because, for example, the blue that I use in my portfolio is actually a color that can only be rendered in RGB because it's so vibrant. And if it's printed, it's actually like a really muddy blue. So I think that's something that's really important to think about. That was also another reason why I chose that blue, because it could only be represented digitally. So I really leaned into that thing. And yeah, the last step is like prayer. So going into the more nitty gritty part of setting up your document, I set it up as web so that I would have kind of a control over the pixel count of the page. I think this matters more later on when you actually export, because you can actually set the PPI, but this will kind of affect the font size when you are doing your InDesign. And I think it's important to think about your representation because it'll only be as clear as the screen that it's shown on. So you don't have to go too high resolution or else it'll just create a really heavy file. And when you're exporting, I chose to do it as an interactive file because then I have this kind of high level compression setting here. For me, I tested out many different PPIs just for this presentation. And I found that with around 150 or 150 is too high and 100 is too low in terms of getting quality of lines. And so I found that when you do 130 PPI, it's kind of like the best balance for me, at least, of file size to line detail. So I think that's something that is quite important to think about. And at this point, when you've selected the right PPI and the right file size, I think most of the time, like 90% of the time, if you've done all of this, you'll have a very like decently detailed and also light file. However, if it doesn't work, then you can also optimize your PDF in Adobe Acrobat or use small PDF and other web tools. I would say use it at your own caution because if you've done all the steps before, sometimes this won't even have such a large effect. But if you use this, it'll further compress your PDFs and sometimes it'll result in really muddy drawings. Like you can kind of see in this one, like a lot of the details are lost, especially back here and in the text. Yeah, especially looking at it in a larger screen. So yeah, and then you pray again and hope that you have the right file size. And before everything, you should always do spell check, or else this will happen. So you don't want that. And yeah, thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Michael. You know, as I said in the introduction earlier, you are both portfolio winners and graduates of you know, the class of 2020. But I think it's so nice to actually look at the two portfolios together because of your very different approaches. I think aesthetically they were very different, but also how you tackle this kind of, you know, situation of, okay, we thought we were going to make a book, but actually we're going to present these all digitally, and how you dealt with that situation was really different. Michael, you push forward with this book idea. You know, you've laid everything out as spreads, as we saw in the presentation. You kept thinking about these page apparatus that are sort of, you know, that you would think about with a traditional book, like the folio, the running head, how deep is the gutter, the margins. I mean, we have to think about margins and bleeds with printed things because, you know, when the book is printed, it gets bound and it gets trimmed. So, you know, these are sort of technical questions that we have to at least consider. So I really appreciate, Michael, how you sort of kept thinking about that, even though you fully knew that you weren't printing right now. At some point, maybe, you know, this does become a printed volume. And Andrew, you actually did pivot and say, well, actually, if people are going to see this on screen, I would rather prioritize that audience and sort of optimize for that experience. So the proportion that you use for the portfolio was very, you know, kind of screen friendly. You had, you know, alluded to the fact that you use this very sort of strong web blue color as your kind of almost like identity color, because it's a color that can only be rendered on screen. You can't print it. And also, you know, the scale of typography and how some of these images are used on the page. The considerations were made with that premise in mind. And I think it's so nice to look at the two examples as sort of a point of contrast. I want to sort of go back to the beginning and ask you a couple of questions. And I think this is in some ways sort of difficult to know, but now that you've done it and you've actually also had to sort of revisit it in putting this presentation together, could you talk to us a little bit about exactly how you might begin? Because, you know, we've talked about this with Gian Rim from last night, and she talked about books in general and how books can be kind of have these kind of personalities or attitudes that they then become form. But how you begin that process is actually quite personal. I think with some designers, it's more of a technical sort of thing. With others, it's much more about kind of, you know, a strategical question of, you know, how does this thing want to feel? So for each of you, where did you begin? How did you start the process? Maybe Andrew, you could start. And actually, maybe both of you should have your mics unmuted so you can kind of jump in at any moment.
Sure. Starting was actually quite interesting. I kind of talked about theme at the beginning, and it was after kind of bringing all my work together in my comprehensive review after Advance 4. I guess everyone will kind of go to these comprehensive reviews with all their work, and they'll kind of go through it with 2 profs. And for me, the big takeaway from I had Mimi and David, and they said to sort of think about how your work kind of strings itself together. And so the best opportunity that we have in making a portfolio is to look at everything. I kind of laid it all out. I wrote out all the titles of the projects and kind of like all of the sort of concepts that I was thinking about, and just tried to find a thread, like any little thing that I could kind of connect them through. And obviously, like, there's no way we could have one's continuous narrative through 6 semesters, but there's always going to be like a consistent part because like we worked on it ourselves and we are a part of that project. So I think I wanted to kind of communicate like sort of my voice as well. So in terms of like creating a less serious portfolio, kind of having like kind of cheeky little moments or kind of different ways to play with the interface of that kind of stuff. So I started off by really looking at everything and thinking about how I wanted to communicate like my own voice in the portfolio, I guess is the way to, how I would say.
Yeah.
To me, and this is, I mentioned it a little bit in the presentation, it is quite similar to, based on, I guess, for each person, how you design and like an architectural project. So for me, it's all about sort of working with the spread, and I guess I approached InDesign similar to how you would approach like making a model or making a drawing, and like using maybe the technicalities of InDesign. For example, for me, like finding out that I could do that underlining as a redaction, that almost triggered an idea of how that could become something more important in the project. So it is a lot about experimentation, and then because I think I tried real hard to like create these categories and find something that would tie it all together, but it just wasn't working. So, and that's how the differences sort of became the main part of the book itself. And yeah, so I would say to me it was working through it. So it's, again, sometimes like just time that will let you sort of arrive at the final form.
I think that's actually often true with design projects. The work always kind of expands to fill the time given, right? So the book, you know, the finished product is whatever, wherever you're at, like when the deadline hits. We have a question here from Aya. Thank you both for your presentations. I have a question about flexibility of the portfolio. Did you think about how to set up your portfolio in a way that would be able to take out or pull in projects depending on where you are sending the portfolio and who's seeing it? I think this is a really good question. I think this is something that, you know, we think about all the time. Can we make a book or a presentation that is maybe has some modularity, has some flexibility, so it can be customizable?
I guess, yeah, I can go. So yeah, I was thinking about this quite a lot during because I wasn't sure. I feel like at the beginning when I started GSAPP, I was under the impression that I would have an academic portfolio and then a professional portfolio that would both look like quite different. Because I don't know, you like the idea is that like, oh, your professional portfolio says like portfolio, has your name, or well, I mean, the academic one also has my name, but just the idea that they look very different. But to me, at the end, it was again more so about removing and adding projects, which in my case was quite time consuming, because the one I have that is professional now, I had to sort of write down the header on each single page again every time I change it. So that's probably not the best method. But part of it was saying, like, being okay with the fact that it might be sending a portfolio that doesn't say portfolio on the front cover to potential employers.
Yeah, I think similarly, I also have like for me, I have a completely different portfolio for professional work, simply because, again, like file size, like they usually want like big, like very generous places will give you 20 megabytes, and then very, like other places will sometimes give you 5 megabytes. So I had to really make a different portfolio that had much more condensed pages with more work on them, and also removing like images that I thought were good for narrative, but not exactly necessary to like show off your skill. So I think for a portfolio for professional work it's a different story in a way than like academic like this one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I think in our minds, we have this sort of idealized scenario where we do one sort of mega book, and by adding and swapping out things or taking something out, it could be used for everyone and for every situation. I think that's actually a very, very difficult thing to achieve. And Andrew, I'm glad you touched on it. It's sometimes when you're speaking to a different audience, maybe the tone has to actually change, and then there are very real technical constraints like file compression. And I was actually glad that you touched on that too, because it's very unglamorous. No one wants to talk about it or deal with it, right? But as you said, when you think you're done with your project, you're actually not done. You have this whole other aspect. So if you're doing a printed portfolio, that aspect is printing. Whether you do it at home or you take it to a professional printing place, that hurdle is definitely not something that you should ignore. But even if you're submitting something digitally, file compression and keeping it at a reasonable size is something that you just have to contend with, even though you don't want to. So I'm really grateful that you touched on that. I thought it was also really nice, Michael, how you showed us some kind of tips and tools of how to deal with fine-tuning typography. I think those are tricks that many of us, I'm sure, are unfamiliar with. So and also this idea of this is actually something that came up last night. One of the questions was, justified type versus unjustified type. There are no correct answers here, but I think the fact, the way you showed how you could massage typography so that by default it looks one way, but with a little bit of care it can look another way. I think that actually demonstrates what you can do. And also with the tools that are available to us, InDesign is a very powerful tool. You can actually do these things and affect these changes, and those changes may not seem like much, but they all add up. And when you look at a portfolio where somebody has actually taken the time and care with the typography, with cropping decisions, sequence, how big or small something is, how much something bleeds off the page, you might not be able to dissect it, but I think you just inherently sort of understand that a lot of care went into it, and it's just nicer to experience. So when you were completing your portfolios, you were, I think, all kind of confined to your apartments, or away from the studio at least, and away from your peers. How was that experience, not being able to, or were you able to share work with your peers and classmates and sort of exchange ideas in the way that you would have done if you were still at school?
I can tackle this. Well, I I was actually, I think for me it was really helpful to be taking your class at the same time, like the typography class, to share, like, and everyone kind of had their own way of approaching the portfolio. So I think that was a really good kind of, maybe not, I know maybe not everyone can have this opportunity, but for me, it was like a really great way for me personally to like reflect on how things actually read instead of just in my own head, like I want it to be this way, so I'll have it this way, but actually like have a response from a group of people. So like I'm sure it would be much harder without being in your class, but I think I would urge for like other people to definitely share their portfolio in working condition, like with friends and stuff if they can.
Michael, how did you deal with it?
Yeah, I
in that
definitely
last
did
semester?
not talk as much as I feel like I should have or would have benefited from. Because I feel like a few times that I did when it was either about file size, like compression, or I remember me and my friend spoke about like whether we should have like a vertical line in the middle of the spread or not, which in the end, it was probably better not to have one and actually design the spread as one whole thing, even though I was meant to be a book. So I do wish I had spoken more. Definitely not as much as I, yeah, wish I had.
I think when you first started showing your portfolios, you did a really nice job of walking us through the different aspects of the book. Like you started with the page size, and then you talked about margins, and then you talked about grid, and so on. Table of contents, and it was really nice to actually sort of kind of divide the book up into these elements and kind of interrogate the book in that way. And I think what was really helpful for the students to see is that one decision is never, this design decision is never independent of another decision. So you had talked about how you wanted the writing to be very tight, right? You didn't want like pages and pages of text. You wanted the text to be very tight, very concise. And you backed it up with typography that was much more accessible, readable, choosing a certain kind of bold typeface. So those two things go hand in hand, like how you wrote and how you presented, how you typeset. Similarly, I think you also talked about at some point, maybe if this thing gets printed and bound, you were thinking of wire binding. And so because you want the pages to lay flat as opposed to a perfect bound book where the kind of binding edge gets kind of sucked in. So you were thinking about these things that are not necessarily visible to us yet, but in your mind, you're already considering these. And I think that's actually something that's super important for everybody to consider. You don't just make a series of independent choices. All of these things stack up and they influence each other. So I think it's also a constant kind of game of making choices and then going back and revisiting them, making some tweaks and going back. And so related to that, but also slightly different, we talked about a lot of the visual choices that you made, but I wanted to ask you about your relationship to the writing. This is something that I often find in student work is, I think sometimes the writing part, it can be a little bit overlooked because the students have lived with these projects for such a long time that it's almost like a part of them. They know it like front to back. So they sometimes forget that a lot of these things need to be explained for somebody that hasn't seen them before. So what was your process like writing, going back to the writing that you've done before, captioning things, explaining things in words?
So for the most part, I think I've always had a blurb for each project. I think that's something that started in Core 1, maybe when we had to document. We're always asked to write a little bit about each project. Or maybe getting it from the final review presentation. I always have like something written down, so I would try to get like maybe like the first paragraph from that. So there's a lot of going back and like finding these like different pieces of text. And that's sort of how I got to the main piece of work. And then the captions, I think, again, it was, trying to make it as explicit as possible. But yeah, for the most part, I think it is about just going through it several times, finding all the typos too, because I also had some typos in mind that I found it just now and I was like, wow. So
That was actually really good advice from Andrea, the spell check. I mean, we should all listen to that advice, I think. Andrea, what about you? How did you deal with the writing and the words that appear in your portfolio?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned it earlier in terms of like writing everything out very plainly and like really plain English, and small words in the beginning of it. It's like just to make it as easy to understand as possible. But similar to Michael, I really went through like all this sort of blurbs and speeches I had on my final presentations. And I broke them apart to use as like ways to guide the viewer through the project. Sort of in like a picture book style, you'd always have like a little bit of like some words that are related to a drawing. I kind of wanted that sort of feeling throughout my portfolio. I don't think, I think a lot of the times I had to go through the speeches and simplify it a little bit. Not incredibly, but like just give them a bit more context, or even shorten them to make them less wordy because we talk a lot. So yeah, that was kind of my process, just like making things easier, less heavy.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that also speaks to what what you had said earlier, which is I think this is again something that came up with Ji and Rim's talk last night, which is thinking about a book as an object that has personality, it has an attitude. And so her advice was like, think about what that is, like what is the personality of this thing, and try to sort of define that, and then make decisions that back up that kind of idea, right? So actually, Andrew, you had earlier on said, I wanted this thing to, not feel too serious. I want it to be accessible and maybe a little bit light. So you had that kind of established, like the personality of your portfolio. And then, going back and sort of tweaking the text to fit that personality, I think actually is really, really smart and very thoughtful. We have another question that's actually quite specific. Which is that, in the COVID times, animations are more common. What do you find most effective in presenting animations in print portfolios when they're the main final deliverable? This is, I think this is an interesting question because it's so specific to now. Unless, you're a student that makes animations all the time, that's just your output in general. But because of the times we're living in, I think a lot of students have used animations as a way to present, right? Present ideas. So when that's your deliverable, when that's the final piece, how do you then bring that back into something that is actually static? Do you guys have any, I don't think either of you have done that in your portfolios, but maybe you've seen examples of how it's done, or do you think it's a bad idea to try to replicate animations in a book? What do you think?
Well, reading the question, I think fewer frames displayed bigger to kind of convey the image, I think is often more effective, because I think if you are showing an animation statically and it's not moving, then having a lot of frames is not exactly helpful to like let someone understand what the drawing is about. So I think finding like the key frames, the key images of those frames will be probably a better way of going about it. Yeah, I think that would be my preference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it would also depend on whether it's the information on each image is more important, or sort of the progression from start to end and all the steps in between is more important. But yeah, I agree with Andrew that potentially having bigger and fewer is better.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you have to, if your main deliverable was an animation, I think you have to ask yourself, what is this animation doing, right? Is it just about, like you said, is it just about the progression, or is it actually the animation was just a technical sort of aspect? It's actually you're trying to show the things, like whether it's a building or a situation or whatever it is. And if that's the case, if you're trying to present it in a more static medium, then is it important to communicate the content within the animation, or are you just trying to tell people that I've made an animation, right? So there is a difference between. So I think you guys have provided really smart answers, which is like, think about what it is that you're showing and show that well, as opposed to trying to replicate the animation, because some things are just kind of can only really be shown in their sort of inherent platform, and it's hard to kind of translate into other platforms. I want to ask you maybe one last sort of parting question, which is, now that you have the hindsight that you do now, and you have a little bit of perspective, and you've had time to sort of maybe think about it or not think about it, is there anything you would have done differently with your portfolio?
I guess to me is in part that, I guess because I did it as a book, I almost wish I had done it the other way. I know that doesn't really answer the question, but I think that's also in part because it's kind of fun to do both. It's also quite nice to see the different variations and how different people did it. And I still need to print mine, so that's probably the next step. But yeah.
Andrew?
For me, I definitely like didn't think about it too much since it was like a lot of job hunting. But like, yeah, in the past couple of weeks, just like looking through it again, I think there was a lot of like decisions that I made that like my grid was not super consistent at different points. And when I was flipping through, especially like the last few projects, it didn't really seem that well thought out. I was probably like pretty sick of like doing the portfolio at that time anyway. So I think like really tightening up like the grid like Michael did, I like, because when I was looking through your presentation, I thought that was like actually quite strong and it was communicated really well. I think that's something that I would have wanted to do. But I guess like the loose nature of it kind of was okay.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both so much. It was really also nice to see your faces again. But thank you for joining us on this Sunday evening. I think I'm sure it was very, very helpful for the students that are just now embarking on this. And I encourage all of you to actually go back to the GSAPP website and look at these two portfolios, but also other portfolios. I think you would just actually learn a lot from just looking through what decisions other people have made. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. And good luck with the portfolios.
Yeah, good luck.
Hi, Josh.
Hi, Yoonjai. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I want to introduce you all to someone that actually needs no introduction, Josh Jordan, a man who is known and loved by the GSAPP community already. He's here to give us a tutorial on how to document physical work, which I know is, it can be challenging, especially right now. As a follow-up to the previous photography tutorials Josh has given, this one is really special and timely because it speaks to the limitations and possibilities of our era and this specific moment. The limitation, of course, being the pandemic and many of us being confined to our domestic spaces, which if you're in New York are not generous, and also not having access to studio equipment or professional help. On the other hand, the possibilities of the technology that's available and is accessible to all of us, and especially these incredible devices that we keep in our pockets, our smartphones paired with some clever hacks and creative workarounds can actually be, I think, quite empowering. So to talk us through exactly how to get there, please welcome Josh Jordan. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Yoonjai. And I'm super excited to be involved with the graphics project. It's kind of an institution at GSAPP that I've been admiring from Schermerhorn for a couple of years. So
oh, amazing.
really happy to be talking to people in this crew.
Thank you.
So I'm not a photo expert. I just play one at GSAPP. Most of what I'm going to talk about tonight is stuff that builds upon the work of photographers and architectural model photographers that have had a presence at GSAPP over the last 5 years, like James Ewing and Michael Varenwald, who's teaching a course right now. But most of it, in reality, comes from the collective you and watching you document your own work and finding sort of inventive ways to do it over the last 5 years. And then as photography sort of permeates representation in I think, new and interesting ways, we have an opportunity to talk about how to do it by yourself at home, since that's kind of how everything is happening these days. So it's really a condensation of the stuff that you may or may not know, with a couple principles and then a couple sort of specific sort of techniques that you can take advantage of when you're using smartphones that you might not be able to do with larger cameras. Like Yoonjai said, this builds upon other photo tutorials and workshops that have happened. Specifically, there was one that I recorded and not recorded, but presented last summer that gets a little bit more into examples of work and the kind of maybe themes behind photography, the sort of idea of subject when it comes to your models versus your architectural ideas, the little broader issues. Tonight, it's mostly brass tacks. So if you're interested in hearing the sort of setup conversation that's a little more abstract, I'd encourage you to watch that previous one. I've also done something tonight that I have not done in 1 year of teaching online, which is pre-record what I'm going to say to you tonight. And that's not because I'm lazy, although I am sort of lazy. It's because it's easier to condense photography, which happens at day and night in different locations, into one talk. So I'm going to play that video now, and I'm going to hover as on the side of the screen. I'll be able to answer questions if anybody has them or chats them mid-presentation. So I am still here, and I am playing it for you. I shouldn't have, this is obvious, I shouldn't have to explain it, but it's the first time I've done it. All right, so share sound. Here we go. Hi, everyone. Happy spring. Happy 2021. Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to look at model photography tonight as done on smartphones. Now, in the shop, we take photography pretty seriously within the scope of the facility here in equipping the place to take adequately professional looking photographs of models that are made in the shop. And so we have the facilities for that. But there's realistically, this is something that you can and probably should be doing at home, that you can recreate a sort of professional setup pretty cheaply and with minimal effort. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. So while I have all of the resources of the shop around me right here, we're not going to look at that tonight. And instead, we're going to look at my apartment. Now, your apartment might be slightly different than mine in terms of the amount of windows or the people that live in it, but the premise is basically the same in how it's different from the shop, in that you have less space, less access to equipment, more things to work around, and maybe less control over the light in the room. So first, before we get into it, I want to talk about what you need, absolutely need versus maybe need, and there's a little bit of blurring between the two. You can figure it out as you go along. Obviously, the first thing that you'll need if you're going to take photos with your smartphone is your smartphone. I'm using an old Galaxy S9 that has a busted screen, but still works as a camera because it's better than my current phone. If you are sort of leveled up from me in phone world and have an iPhone, you probably have a better camera on your phone than I do. Either one will work perfectly, and the workflow that we're going to go over today is the same basically for both of them. The next thing that's absolutely essential to this, at least I'm arguing it is a miniature tripod. You can get these for, between 10 and 15 bucks on your favorite internet retail outlet that I won't name. But the idea is that it can extend, a little bit more than maybe up to 2 feet. This one is pretty rinky-dink, has legs that can sort of collapse in. It's really flimsy, but the best part about smartphone photography is that you don't need something that's sturdy to hold up your smartphone. What the tripod does need, however, is a way to hold on to your phone. So the one that I have right now that I'm showing has a little extra component that I bought separately that actually grabs onto your phone. But you can buy a lot of this ensemble as one thing, tripod and smartphone holder together for pretty much the same cost. The other things that you absolutely need are a good backdrop. And I'm going to work today with a white one and a black one. They make photo backdrop paper that you can purchase online or in photo stores. Just take really any higher quality, slightly matte is better paper will work that has a little bit of heft to it. For the black backdrop, I'm going to be using a piece of fabric today that is currently sitting behind the camera drying. Black foam core works as well. But remember, you're going to need something in terms of paper to sort of take up the flex of the little photo studio that we're going to show today. Another thing you're going to need is tape. Masking tape is fine. Have some, I just mentioned foam core, have some extra on hand that you can use for what we're going to call a bounce board, reflecting light, white in this case. Another thing I'm suggesting as required, just because it's so inexpensive, are either barbecue skewers or chopsticks and hot glue. Where's my hot glue gun? It's right here somewhere. But combination of little rigid elements and masking tape and hot glue, you'll basically be able to build any sort of miniature frame to create your photo studio. Okay, so what's optional in this workflow? This one, a remote shutter button for your camera, for your smartphone, works with your smartphone. These are about, I don't know, $7 online and are kind of a game changer in terms of any kind of photo studio having a remote shutter. These are Bluetooth. Just about every generic one works equally with iPhones and Androids as far as I've found. Super easy to set up. Really, really great for streamlining your workflow. A couple other things that are optional depending on how sort of complex you want to get into your lighting tweaks are diffusing elements like trace paper, also aluminum foil for masking off light and reflecting it more vividly than, say, a white balance board. Finally, and this is optional because it depends very much on your situation, but extension cords. This is a super cool one that has outlets along the run of the, say, 12-foot cord, so you can plug things in. This is almost professional, this level, what you would use in a photo studio. You can use any sort of rinky-dink little extension cords will do, but you'll need them, trust me. The last thing that I would put on the optional sort of category, even though it's not optional, is light sources that you're going to need to take photos. So obviously that's not optional, but I say optional because it's optional that you might go in and get yourself a little $10 battery-powered light source that you can move around easily. The non-optional, essential version of this is just using desk lamps from your house or using natural light if you have the kind of setup that permits it. One of the other optional elements I want to splice in here today is gels, aka acetate, colored plastic transparencies. These, you can edit a lot of the quality of the light and exposure in post-processing, editing your photos. What you can't do as easily is selectively edit colors of light in different parts of the photograph. So what do you need camera-wise, software-wise, on your smartphone? Well, almost nothing. I'm going to give you one required thing and one optional thing. First thing you need is the camera software on your phone. And on most phones, the onboard camera is great. This is an Android phone, and I guess a Samsung phone, which has its own software. And what I'm going to do is just find Pro mode or manual mode, or they might call it something else on different phones. The thing that Pro mode does, kind of hard to see the little emblems here, but it gives you control over all of the camera settings, the optical settings, the shutter settings, the aperture settings, all of those things that add up to professional photography. You can tweak them within your phone's parameters. Having the ability to change the focus manually on your phone's camera will open up a lot of other little possibilities of what you can do. So iPhone onboard camera software is great. iPhones actually have two, the newer sort of super duper iPhones have two primary lenses built in at different lengths, so you can take different zooms of photographs. The other piece of software that I'm going to show you though is Lightroom Mobile. So this is available for both Androids and iPhones. And what it is a sort of like a stripped down miniature version of the Lightroom that you have installed on either your computer or your studio computer that you have access to. And it's a simple version of it. The key part is that you can sync. And I'm going to show you just in a minute how to set up syncing between your phone and Lightroom on your computer, which means you're essentially just creating a tether between your phone camera and Lightroom on your computer, where you can do everything you need to make the photos look awesome. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a table and a backdrop. But the basic idea is that you create as seamless a surface as you can with your backdrop. If yours is like me and there's dog hair all over it, every time you flinch, you'll have to spend a little extra time cleaning it off, but so goes it. All right, so I've obviously set up a black background instead of a white one, but the key difference in this setup that I want to show you is the separation between the backdrop and the table itself. You can do this either with a white or a black background or whatever color background you happen to be using, but this setup is slightly different and you can get some things out of it that you can't get out of the other one and vice versa. All right, for the sake of comparison, let's just take a couple pictures really quickly to see where we can get to. So I'm going to use Lightroom's onboard camera because it's there in the Lightroom mobile app, just on the auto settings, and using my remote trigger button, take the photograph. Not a bad photograph, very, very evenly lit, but in frame, sharp enough with the auto settings. So not a bad photograph, pretty plain, but one of the disadvantages of this sort of technique is that there's not too many ways to go from here, because I have very little control over the level of ambient light in the room. In fact, there's just way too much of it. So what can you do to control the ambient light in your room? If you're using the natural light that's coming in the windows, the way that you want to set yourself up primarily is, if you can, have your natural light source be 90 degrees to, or about 90 degrees to your stage that you're setting up photographs in. So if you have a window over here, coming in from my right, you want everything to be sitting, facing perpendicularly to it. Using direct sunlight can be very, very difficult because the intensity of the light just washes the shadows out immediately and you get things that look like this. So how can you, in the daytime, control the light in your space? Well, you can try anything that you have available to yourself. If you have blackout curtains like some people have, those are really handy in blocking out the light. Or you can do the sort of old school method and pin up blankets and sleeping bags and whatever else you have around to block the light out as much as you can. Since you still want to be letting light through, if you're using shades or blankets to block out the natural light that's coming in your room, give it an ability to come in still that's sort of as controlled and minimal as possible. So what photo studios will sometimes do is have a strip light for a directional fill light. You can imitate that by having two blankets pinned up on a window and just let light come in through the crack. Anything that you can do to sort of control the amount of angles that light is coming from. So it's going to be very different if you have a diffuse sheer curtain over a big window versus having very bright light coming just through one little sort of 1 foot strip in the window is generally better. Another thing I didn't mention that you'll see in professional photography setups is that they'll have a million tripods to hold up everything that they're using to stage the scene. Unless you have a million tripods, this option will not be available to you. So how are you actually going to be holding and positioning things around the room, lights, gels, with anything that you can find. So chairs, tables, stacks of books, selfie sticks, especially rigid plants, whatever you have, use it to hold things up in the scene. So let's look back for a second really quickly at the photograph that we already took and some others that I've taken during the day in this condition of diffuse light. So I don't have any artificial lights around on in the room right now, which is good for the photo setup. But light is sort of coming from everywhere. So you'll see that these photos are all very evenly lit. There's not a lot of contrast going on between one part of the object or the scene and another. Or in the case that there's sunlight falling directly on it, there are absolutely stark contrasts. Some of these photos may be usable for particular things, or if you just happen to capture the right moment. In other cases, you get a sort of a flat lighting. It's good for wedding photography, but maybe not for staging model photographs. So what can you do in this case? Well, you can wait for night. Nighttime is when your photos will be way more sensitive to the light conditions that you produce. So you'll have way more granular control over where lights are coming from, what they're lighting, what light is not doing. What you may lose a little bit control over is getting a sort of a full, even light in the scene, which you can take advantage of during the day, and then take advantage of more targeted and specific light during the night. All right, back in daytime, let's talk about those camera settings in manual mode real quickly before we start taking photographs. And there's a couple things I want you to look for. One is switching it into manual or professional mode. It gives you a couple options that you can see here on the display. The option to change the shutter speed, which will actually give you an approximate preview of what the exposure in that is going to look like. The option to change the ISO, which is the sort of film sensitivity setting. The higher the ISO you go, the more grainy and noisy your photograph is going to look. So in most situations, you want to keep ISO low if you can. Probably the most important setting that I'm going to show is the ability to control focus manually, like you would do in a normal camera. So you can see here I'm panning the focus between close and far away. But what I want you to do is look in the closest focus setting. Test how far you can be from an object and still get it in focus. So you can see right now that the wall of the side of this model is out of focus. It doesn't come sufficiently into focus until I back up. I'm between 3 and 4 inches away from that. That number is something you should remember because that's your minimum focus distance, and it's going to determine what you can possibly have in focus in the scene, no matter how hard you try. Now, another thing that I want to show you that sort of qualifies as an optional part of this workflow, but I think is really, really awesome and worth checking out, is syncing Lightroom on your phone with Lightroom on your computer, where you can do much more sophisticated edits and sort of have everything in a workflow management that works really well. I would show you that there are onboard editing tools in Lightroom, like you might have in VSCO or just on your phone natively, that let you sort of change exposure and contrast and sort of tweak things a little bit. That's good. It's better to do it on a big screen where you can actually see things more clearly and more in detail, and you have sort of more flexibility of zooming in and out. But the thing that I really want to show you here in Lightroom Mobile is this little cloud up here in the top that says it's synced. So as long as you sign in with your Adobe account to Lightroom Mobile, and also sign in to Lightroom on your laptop or desktop, you can have them as long as they're connected to the same Wi-Fi network, syncing constantly. So all of the photos that I've been taking here are coming right into Lightroom, where I can do a lot more with them. Now, one of the main benefits to taking model photographs with your smartphone that we just talked about is how close you can get the focus to work to your camera lens. On the flip side, one of the main drawbacks of using a smartphone to take photographs is that you have way less flexibility over the called angle, wide or tight, the lens length that you're using to take photographs. I'm going to assume that you only have one sort of typical lens on your camera, which is a wide angle lens for most smartphones, usually around 27 or 28 millimeters, which qualifies as a sort of a medium wide perspective. You might have your typical ground level or occupant level, and it is a perspectival shot. So this is what you use a wide angle lens for. It captures the sort of perspective, the foreshortening, the things that you would get as an observer in a scene. The sort of far other end of type of shot that you might take is a zoom shot. Now I'm going to use the digital zoom on my camera just to demonstrate. Do not do this. Zooming in with the sort of onboard digital zoom of your smartphone will result in low quality photos. So if anything, crop your photo. The point is to show that this type of shot flattens the perspective in the scene. Everything is the farther away that you get, and the longer the lens that you use, the more it looks like an axonometric projection of it, where everything, there's no foreshortening, no perspective. So let's look at 3 example photographs with techniques in each of them. For example number 1, let's try to take a relatively straightforward, maybe mundane shot and transform it into something more interesting. We're going to look at the view of the camera. Again, I'm using Lightroom's onboard camera because it's convenient. And if you use Lightroom's onboard camera and you have sync on, it automatically syncs to Lightroom and computer. You might like your camera app better. It's fine, use it. It'll just give you an extra step. So I have an object from Transitional Geometries here. These models belong to Wendy Wan, who kindly left them behind for me. And I'm going to sort of really quickly walk through the fundamental pieces of a lighting setup. Lighting it's a fruit punch of factors and feelings and flavors, and you're never going to get it entirely sort of rigorously down. What I'm going to just try to do is emphasize the importance of having a methodology, starting simple and then building up from there. So right now you're looking live through the camera view. I have every room light on. Some are halogen, some are LED. Who knows? Light is bouncing off the walls. There are about 50 different shadows being thrown on this. It's just a confusing amount of light. So I'm going to turn everything off. This is a starting point. So all I have left on here is one single light. This light I have it's an LED light, the battery powered one I talked about. You can use a flashlight or a desk lamp would be really good. Try to use LED lights just for the sake of not burning down your apartment. If you're going to be wrapping diffusing paper around lights, make sure it's not a hot incandescent or especially halogen bulb. A one light setup is the sort of simplest, maybe like portraiture light you could try to take. It gives you this kind of high contrast, moody photo. You get definitely a spicier picture, one that's telling a little bit more of a story, a little bit more emphasis on what's going on. But there are some pretty serious shadows washing out on the other side of this. So one strategy to mitigate these shadows is to add something to bounce light around. You can see I'm just using a big white piece of styrene or foam core or whatever you have. And immediately you can see that you've taken up the sort of darkest shadows on the side. It's a really good way to selectively edit the light. It's about directional emphasis of light, but yet light filling the scene from the other side as well. This is what you'll see in a portrait setup. If you want to go to a 2-light setup, there's a couple ways you can do it. So instead of bouncing light around with a white board or something reflective, you can add a second light at a different value. This 2-light setup is usually called a key light and a fill light. They typically start at something like, coming at your subject from, can't get around this screen, coming at your subject from 45-degree angles. So a diffuse fill light, what we would call a key light, or something spotlighting the piece somewhere else. I have my shutter here now, so I can take photos as I need to. You'll notice something that's happening as I change the light levels is that the camera, my film camera, is automatically adjusting to it. This is a good time to get in the manual settings of the camera. So I'm going to lock it on a relatively slow shutter speed at a 10th of a second, and an ISO of whatever, 110, it's relatively low. So now those manual settings are locked in. So when I change the light in the scene, I can actually see the result of those changes in the camera. This is why it's important to get to know your manual mode. All right, what other type of lights can we do in a 2-light setup? Well, the other main sort of position or type of light that we might talk about is called a rim light or a hair light. It's called a hair light because in a portrait studio, they like putting lights behind the subject so that you get a sort of a backlit edge. You get a really high contrast contour to the edge of your subject. Like I said, this is a sort of esoteric and trial and error kind of thing. So play around with even adding ambient light back into the room, using a brighter, more diffuse lights to get sort of right balance of contrast and shadows that you actually want in the scene. Next, I want to do a quick, say to push this a little further, we want to try some more kind of interior scene. So let's try to stage it a little bit. Important sort of rule of thumb is that it's better to move your models around than it is to move the camera. Only because when you're taking multiple photographs and you want the background and the sort of set to be identical as much as possible so that you can do the same edits and additions to multiple photos. So when in doubt, if you have the option, it's better to move your stuff around than it is to move your phone. All right, a little clumsy, but it's getting there. A little blown out. Maybe I go back and reset the exposure. All right there. I love it. Take the photo. Okay, photo taken. You'll notice that we're getting to the point where it's having trouble focusing on things that are entirely in the foreground. That's a product of being too close to the camera. So if you want to get these scalies that are right up in the camera in focus, you're going to have to manually turn the focus to be close at the cost of the background going out of focus. Now, this is an effect that you might like for sort of dramatic effect and separation of subject. But it can also be an effect, you see, if we go focus in the background, that makes the foreground go out of focus and you sort of lose the believability of scale in a way. So try to find the best focus region for the photograph, and then a little later I'm going to show you how to deal with that problem specifically. So one more thing while we're on this scene. But we talked about the use of color gels, plastic film of different colors that you can put over lights to sort of spice up the photograph. What the point I want to make is that it's not so much about spice so much as new ways of creating contrast within a scene. So say I have a scene which I'm trying to sort of depict and accentuate an interior and an exterior condition. I can use colored gel lights instead of my key lights and my rim lights to really create a lot of color separation between the interior and exterior, or whatever other conditions you're trying to depict here. Now, this can clearly get out of control and turn into a sort of a rave really fast. But the point is that it's another tool there that's in your arsenal that can be used mixed in with your other lights to create sort of new contrast that you're looking for. Okay, so hopefully that showed with this example how you can go from a pretty mundane flat photograph to something that's really sort of rich with minimal set of moves. Just positioning of lights, really like you should really only have to be using 2 lights, except for maybe very special effects. Position of camera, lock it into place, and then the manual manipulation of camera settings to get what you want. Example number 2, more of an entire building at scale model, a little bit more of an architectural object, and on a black backdrop. This time with that separation that we talked about between the table and the background. Right now, it's, I have all the lights on in the room. It's not a terrible photo. It's sharp. It does kind of have the effect of like when you're at a show and the lights come up after the end of it, like you're sort of seeing the stage revealed. So let's see what we can do to transform it into a little bit more of an interesting composition and photograph using the lighting principles that we looked at in the last example, maybe employed a little bit differently, and a couple extra, call them tricks or techniques that you can use in combination or independently, depending on what you're setting up. Okay. All right, so we start again with a single light source. You can see there's enough like lattice work and stuff happening in this model that it throws some pretty interesting shadows onto itself, something you should consider. There are a lot of dark spots that are happening within. This is pretty high contrast. So remember, the first line of defense is to try to provide a little bit of reflective surface for it to bounce things around on. I'm going to put the remotes. Another really good reason to get that $7 remote. Okay, already I like it better. So like last time, I'm going to lock the exposure settings in so it looks correctly exposed. Yeah, that surface bouncing the light on the other side is doing wonders, right? It's like I don't even need a second light or a fill light at this point. The only thing is I might want to get a little light to go into that sort of cavity in the building. And take a couple in the more high contrast version. But not a bad photograph. All right, so what are a couple things that we can do from here? Like you can do the things that we looked at last time of adding sort of colored light. It might be a little bit different, more difficult in this sort of more object-like model to get those interior-exterior things going on. But another thing you can do is, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, is using lights as backdrop. So since I have this small amount of separation, I can actually use the backdrop to throw light onto and get this kind of gradient effect there. This works on any color of backdrop. If you have a nice flat, non-drier wrinkled backdrop like mine, it'll be a little bit more flat and less textured. But the point is that you can use it like this. Create a little horizon line. My table also has like a funny Noguchi shape to it, so it's not a straight horizon line like mine. You can see, like, just use light as, not to sort of belabor the cliche, but use light as paint. All right, it's looking all right. One last little sort of technique or trick, if you will, is doing something with your surface itself that you're taking photographs on. And sometimes adding a reflective surface can go a long way, not just for depicting reflective conditions like water, but for changing the composition in ways that you might not exactly expect. So I have a piece of glass here because, of course, I have a piece of glass. Plexi will work just fine. My piece of glass is not quite big enough to really get framed correctly here. This is without the lights in the back. That looks like. Nah, I like it with the lights. Turn the lights on. Let's take this exposure down a little bit. It's getting pretty bright here. Now I have the benefit of having these dimmable lights, but you can just do it with physically moving them. Maybe I want to get a little bit more of that. It's sometimes it's difficult to ground your photographs in a scene. And adding reflectivity to the base can help with that a lot. You can just add up these features to get progressively more crazy as you want to. Okay, the last little thing that I want to show you with this example is some of the quick edits that you can do in Lightroom with a photograph like this and like Lightroom in general. So you see I have Lightroom tethered or synced to Lightroom Mobile, and all of the pictures I've been taking so far are coming in. There might actually be a crack in my camera glass. It's perfect. Just Photoshop it out. But this is probably the best place to look at your photographs and to do edits to them. So on a photograph, this first one I took looks pretty good. Some of these look a little overexposed. I'm just going to go with the first one. So I'm going to take the exposure down a little bit and then bring up. It's a game when you have your backdrop black of chasing out the backdrop while preserving the shadows and highlights of the thing that you want to take a picture of. Clearly, it's better to have a more blacker backdrop and one that's not fuzzy and covered with rug and dog hair like mine. It's going to happen at your house. Don't worry too much about it. But the real thing, you can go crazy exploring these settings in Lightroom, but the real thing I want to show you is a perspective correction. So in architectural photography, one of the main challenges of building scale photographs is perspective correction, because you're inevitably, to capture a whole building, you're going to be unless you're Iwan Bond and have free access to helicopters all the time, you're probably going to be on the ground, and you're probably going to be using a wide-angle lens to capture it, which is going to do perspective distortion and stuff like that. So what professional photographers sometimes do is use lenses that correct for that automatically. But what we can do really easily in Lightroom is make some of those perspective corrections ourselves. So if you look down here, if you go down to transform, there's an option to do a guided perspective correction, and it actually asks you to pick two vertical lines. Great, done. Which will straighten your photograph, which will correct for some of the foreshortening. More importantly, it'll give it that look like the photograph was taken with a longer lens to flatten the perspective a little bit. There's situations where you don't want this, but it's often easier to understand sort of overall form of a building, especially a rectilinear one, if perspective is corrected. And you can do it right here. What else do we have? Ooh, black and white. Like that one. What do we think? Okay, next thing. I'm going to show us one last third scene here to demonstrate something about using focus. Not so much focusing on the scene, although it's a little bit different than the others. How to actually use the focusing tools of your camera and software to get a picture that you wouldn't normally be able to capture in model photography otherwise. So this scene is set up similarly light-wise. Well, let's just say it is to our other scenarios where we have, turn our camera on, where we have a dark room. We have a primary light source that's diffused. This is kind of halfway between your key light and your fill light. That is to say, it is one directional light, but it's a little bit diffused. And then I'm not liking the harshness of the shadows it's getting there, so I might start by bringing in something to bounce light around in the scene a little bit, and you can just see already the palpable difference in the shadows on the far side of objects. But for the sake of this exercise, let's say that I'm going to put second weaker fill light in here. It's not the most beautiful lighting I've ever seen. There's hard shadows bouncing everywhere, but just go with me for the sake of the exercise. Now, we have everything here in a sort of a eye level view perspective of the scene. Again, I'm doing it in portrait mode just for the ease of using this smartphone for demonstration. But I have things in the foreground and the background and some degree of foreshortening going on because I'm using a smartphone wide lens. So what happens if, like Bob Ross, I come in here and try to ruin it with a happy little tree in the foreground right at the last second? A couple of those. I'm not sure if I can get him to stick straight up. Nope. Oh, I'm definitely going to cut this. Okay, super easy. Now I have objects in the scene that are too close to the camera lens to capture everything in focus. When your camera is trying to focus really close to the subject, by the nature of optics, your depth of field is going to get way shallower, and it gets larger proportionally as you go away from the lens, which is why when you take a picture of things far away, they're all in focus. One way that you can tweak this in the shot is to change the focus manually, like we talked about. So you can see here I have it focused perfectly on the back of the scene, and you can see here I have it focused perfectly on the front of the scene. I would say just aesthetically out of the box, shot like this is more pleasing, but when you have a shallow depth of field, especially in model photography, it has that kind of effect of suspending disbelief of the size of the thing. Once you see something, very separated from its background, your eye and brain immediately say it's small, just because that's what we're used to seeing when we focus. So if we could somehow collapse all of these different focus lengths into one shot, we would get something that is entirely in focus despite being close to the camera, and bring the illusion of sort of scale and size that's not naturally there. So we do that with a technique called focus stacking, which I'm going to show you really quickly. So this requires a jump into another program or two in Photoshop, but the process is pretty streamlined, and it's worth knowing, especially if you're doing interior shots or really close-up photography of interior scenes. So this is where it's really important to learn your manual settings and go in here and make sure everything is locked. So I'm going to put it on, I'm going to lock it on the slowest shutter speed possible, which is 1/10 of a second. I'm going to sort of find an ISO level that I like the exposure for. Sure. Maybe I'm going to change the perspective a little bit. Yeah. Auto white balance is locked, so I don't need to mess with that. And then what I'm going to do is going from the foreground to the background, or vice versa, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to take multiple photographs, moving the focus a little bit each time. I might be doing it a little rushed and clumsily here and skipping over a couple sections of focus, but you can take your time. And you can see I'm actually getting almost to the back of the camera's focal range before I'm getting everything in focus, especially in the background. And now at this point, everything in the background, in the foreground is blurred. So this shot immediately screams miniature model. It's something that we wouldn't want to use right out of the box. So let's hop into Lightroom and talk about a couple things and then go right into Photoshop. So since I have it synced so conveniently to Lightroom, I can see all of the photos that have been bounced right out of the camera to the computer here. I look through the list and I see these 6 photographs are the ones that I took for this stacking exercise. Very important to notice, you see how the crop of the image changes ever so slightly for each different focus. This is the same thing with larger cameras, big lenses, DSLRs. When you change the focus of the camera, you're actually changing the frame as well, which is why it's important to use Photoshop to do all the alignment for you. So here, I'm going to shift select a bunch of these and bring the exposure down a little bit, bring highlights up a little bit, maybe clarity. Nah, clarity, no clarity. Let's just leave it right, just where it is right now. Let's also put a crop and hope that it doesn't mess with our alignment. All right, that looks good. Now, since I have these 6 images selected, I can go up to sync here, and it'll apply the same visual effects and crop settings to all of them. So now you can see them. You can see them cycling through the focus there. The background's in focus here, foreground is in focus here. All right, am I still selected? Let's go export. And I'm gonna cut this part out while I click around and export them correctly. So next, I'm gonna hop over to Photoshop. Let's start something. You actually don't have to start a new blank file at all. What I want you to do is, before you even have a blank page or template open, oh, there we go, scripts. Technical difficulties. What you're looking for is File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. So this is going to ask you for a number of files instead of an individual file. I'm going to go to the files I exported from Lightroom and import them. Now, this is important. You have to click Attempt to automatically align source layers. Otherwise, it's going to have a really hard time blending the focus together. But let's start with that and see what we get. Thinking, thinking, thinking. Okay. Now you can see what we have is, if I start turning off these layers, you can see that they're all stacked on top of each other in near perfect alignment. There's a little bit, maybe it's just because of the blur, little bit of misalignment there. Once you have them all aligned and in a layer stack, you're going to go to Edit, Auto Blend Layers. And then you have 2 options. One is to create a panorama, which is really useful. One is to stack the images. Now you can stack images in multiple ways. You can stack the focus of images. You can stack the exposure of images, which is what star and night sky photographers do. But we're going to be stacking the focus. So make sure that we have seamless tones and colors is checked, and I would uncheck content aware fill. This, depending on the size and the number of the files in the stack, is a beefy operation for any computer. It might take a little while. It might also blow up my computer. That's always a possibility. Okay, check it out. This is a photo that's entirely in focus from front to back. And you can see that what it has done is created these really, really complex masks. And then it's feather blended them seamlessly into each other on each layer. So that's the shape of one mask, that's the shape of the next. It actually gives you a cool readout of where focus regions are. And you can see I've covered, looks like I've covered just about everything in this stack. It doesn't look like anything except maybe here at the very bottom is out of focus. This effect becomes more and more profound the closer you get to what might be an eye level or observer photograph, especially if you have scale figures in it, especially if you have architectural elements, if you're doing the interior of a room. As long as you don't have objects within that 3 or whatever inches minimum focus distance to your camera lens, you can pull this off and get the entire thing in focus without having to go to a really, really tiny aperture that you might have on a bigger DSLR camera. Truly weird to try to watch that and comment on it at the same time. I'm not used to that. So really quickly, I would say the big takeaways are purchasing a little bit of equipment to make your setup more consistent, a tripod, and that shutter button is really amazing. The main advantages of smartphone photography is that close focal length that lets you do those focus tricks that makes things look sort of unminiature is actually something that smartphones are way better at than typical lenses. So if your lens that comes with your DSLR probably has a minimum focus length, if you've tried to take model photos with it, you found that you need to back way off, and it's hard to get sort of interiors. Smartphones are particularly good at that, which is why not just because of value and using them at home, they're specifically good for that, unless you buy a really expensive DSLR lens that's supposed to do that, like a macro lens. The main technical disadvantage of using your smartphone is that you have less zoom and perspective control. So you can't really get those AXO-looking flattened photographs that do perspective correction that you might do in actual architectural photography, but that you can simulate some of that in Lightroom. And then the third thing that I didn't really talk about in the video is the value of staging photographs and trying to get as much as you can out of the shot as staged. As what you see on the camera is like really, really far along. It's this is one of the ways where it's really different from a rendering, where a rendering might like be very rudimentary when it's coming out of V-Ray, and you're like, well, I know I'm going to do everything in Photoshop. I have the tools and the strategy, and I've sort of storyboarded how I'm going to do it, or Illustrator, maybe just as much or more these days. But photography really is something that gives you the chance to do everything in camera, because it's way better at grounding things in the scene and sort of like really immersing all of the things, the subjects that you're putting in there to stage, to make them look sort of more comprehensive and believable. So when you're taking model photographs, like try to stage as much. Like you might end up thinking that your scalies look dumb and you want to just Photoshop them in, that's fine. But take the chance and try to stage things as much as you can. It lets you think on your feet more and sort of change things on the fly and get things you may not have expected out of it as well. Okay, that's all I got.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I feel like I've learned so much, and that focus stacking thing that you did was like, I couldn't believe what these softwares can actually do. And of course you have to set it up in a way that makes sense. But after the progress bar of realism has completed, it's unbelievable what these softwares are capable of.
I really quickly, I feel like that my urge to figure out how to do that came from seeing a Christian Keres exhibition that was in the lobby of GSD like 10 years ago. And he has these massive models and was really sort of serious about photographing them. But all of the photographs had like a big scaly right in the foreground that was completely out of focus. And I was just like walking through it wincing at how like beautiful and perfect these scenes were and how like elaborately and caringly they were staged. But there was this little photo effect that it was like a tick that you can now, through use of Photoshop and things, sort of work your way around that.
Yeah. Well, and thank you again for putting together this incredibly thorough tutorial, which is going to be an amazing resource for the current students. But I have a feeling that the younger, the more junior students that don't even realize that they need these skills yet are going to look up this video in the future and be grateful that it exists. I have one. I mean, you sort of touched on it slightly at the end there, but I have a question about shoot versus post. So the things that you have to do, the lighting, the setting up the camera, the tripods, and the reflective surfaces and all of these things. Like it takes a long time to set up that shoot, and then you go through the shoot, and it could be tiring, it could be tedious, it could take a lot of time to get to the point that you want. And I think I've definitely been in a situation where you feel really you're tempted to just be like, oh, I'll just fix that in post. I'll just Photoshop that in later. And you've mentioned this slightly, but what are good things to really get in the shoot versus things that you can actually sort of fix in Photoshop or in kind of other software later?
I think that one of the things that's important to get in the shoot is your any background lighting you're doing versus model lighting. So like when I showed in the one example of sort of transforming the background through actually showing spotlights in the background and creating gradients. I mean, that's a literal way to do it. That's a particular kind of photograph. But even the thing where you have the kind of predominant light coming from one direction and are bouncing it from the other, how that is, that the brightness of that, this might be like, I might be getting a little specific here, but it's really about how bright your model and subject is on its background. The moment that you go into Photoshop thinking that, the one thing that you shouldn't really be thinking that you're going to be doing in post-production is drawing like a little marquee around the perimeter of your model and cropping it out and dropping it somewhere else. This is no shade being thrown on Andrew and his portfolio, which actually did it. It did that extremely well. But you want to keep the option open to leaving the background that you're photographing with in the final photograph. So getting the kind of like eliminating shadows that you don't want as much as possible, that can be a really important step. And that's the kind of magic sauce where it's like, I can't even really do it every time until I'm like, oh, that's it. I got the light right there. Like you see these guys like James Ewing, who did the stagecraft photo exhibition in Ross Gallery a couple of years ago. He takes all day to stage one photograph. So it's like, it's 6 hours of work going back and forth and setting it up. Not to say that all of your photo shoots should take that long, but it is kind of like, it's going to take longer than you think it's going to take. But it's worth doing that. The getting the light on the model versus the light on the background, I think is important to do in camera. The 50-50 proposition, I think, is the scalies and sort of like ephemera and other objects in the scene, because clearly you have more freedom in photoshopping things into the scene that aren't there. But not only the effect of sort of realistically grounding things with shadow and perspective by having them actually in the scene, but I find that just the physical act, I know I'm going to get all like woo-woo about the value of working with your hands here, but the physical act of moving pieces around the scene and seeing where they sit and where they gather and where they stage, there's kind of like a little bit of a magic sauce there where I feel like you're just going to be more able to compose interesting narratives with your subjects in your scene when you're moving them around physically, and you can see it with instant feedback in real time. Like we've all gone through our collection of scalies and tried to like assemble enough of them into a scene to have like a posse of people hanging out in your architecture project, right? That you can just go through that process much quicker when you're staging it first. So at least try that is what I would say.
Yeah, and as you said, I think setting up the shoot that's the tedious part. That takes a long time, and it can take a very, very long time. And I'm a graphic designer, so I don't usually have to shoot things that are super 3D or huge in scale. A lot of things I have to document are sort of flatter things, which actually can be surprisingly hard to shoot. But the thing that I constantly remind myself or at our studio is, once we have the setup, let's just try some different things. Like let's just like change the backdrop color. You don't know, because you think you want this blue backdrop, but actually when you have the photographs later, you like the yellow one. This kind of thing happens all the time. So if you're going to put in the work, I think it's actually sort of worthwhile trying some different things, and maybe even things that seem a little bit wacky or that you didn't expect to be doing, just to make it all worthwhile and see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely, like, even when I was the doing the sort of the color contrast lighting, it almost felt obligatory because I just see it sort of in so much work, like in the last 3 years, that I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do something about color gels and high contrast. But once I did it, I'm like, oh, actually, that's amazing.
Yeah.
You like James Ewing always brings a smoke machine to his shoots because he's like, well, maybe I'll pull it out and maybe I won't. There's just way more opportunity for discovery when you're working with a set like that.
Yeah. And maybe lastly, you had in the beginning said that you are actually not a photographer by trade, but you've acquired these skills. So as a kind of amateur photographer, how do you learn these skills? And when you want to try something new or figure out how to do something, where do you go? What resources do you look to?
Well, I lurk in reviews at GSAPP to see people's, especially in the age of mirror boards, and getting to see everybody's work at once, no matter when you drop into the review, has been sort of game changing for just seeing the scope of photography that's being done.
Incredible.
Like I don't always see everything, like I don't even see finished models because they happen overnight before final reviews after they leave the shop. But so like I learned how to take film photographs first. Anybody who has a DSLR and has never tried to shoot on full manual mode, I would recommend doing that because you learn a lot about the relationship between aperture and shutter speed. It's kind of like driving manual or standard where there's like, you're like, oh, there's too many things moving simultaneously. But once you do it a couple times, you really realize the control that you have over your photographs by manipulating those settings that you might not have already. And then like, I'm just gonna do the cheapest thing and shout out to like 9-minute YouTube videos that show you like very particular techniques, one over the other. I'm sure that's where I looked up how to do focus stacking, like in Photoshop, you know, CC 2017 or something like that. There's tons of resources out there, and they're very well produced, and they're all like under 6 minutes to fit into your attention span. But like, I think architectural photography is its own body of work that exists like within and parallel to photography and art photography and gallery photography. And it's worth getting to know like the story of Iwan Baan and like what his photographs have done for architecture. Not just that he's like, you know, like at some point between 10 and 15 years ago, he was like the guy that everybody had to get. Well, it's because he was representing things very uniquely. And like representation and photography were changing at the same time. And it's like, you can tell why, you can tell how sort of distinct and independent architectural photography is as a practice. So it's worth getting to know the work of different architectural photographers, contemporary and historically, to see like, you know, how that's changed over the years, like what we do the same, what we do differently. Like what we do differently now is that we can commandeer a helicopter during the New York Hurricane Sandy blackouts, and we have lenses that can take super fast, highly exposed photos in the middle of the night without a lot of light. So there's been technical changes, but a lot of things have been the same for the last 50 years.
Okay, well, with that, we will let you go. Thank you so much again, Josh. And thank you not only for your time tonight, but I know it took many hours to put that video together. So thank you.
I love Adobe Premiere.
For those of you that are still here, I just want to remind you that next weekend we have the portfolio reviews. So you will receive an email about that and details on how to sign up and what you're required to bring. Everybody's thanking Josh in our chat. Thank you. All right. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.